The following video contains heavy spoilers for Clair Obscur Expedition 33. This video presumes you've already finished the game or otherwise don't care about spoilers. Please consider this your last and final warning before proceeding. Let's start this video off with a simple question. Have you ever finished a great book, put it down, and then immediately felt a sense of loss? Or have you finished an especially interesting graphic novel before, or TV series or movie, and felt that emptiness which remains? There are a few names for it, depending on the medium. I've heard it called post-book blues or post-movie depression. Why, there have even been research journal articles written about so-called post-game depression. Whatever you call it, the underlying mechanism is the same. A compelling narrative makes for a meaningful experience. It causes you to feel things. You get emotionally invested. But all stories come to an end, don't they? And when the story ends, what we are left with is so-called narrative grief. Now, everyone handles this narrative grief in different ways. Some of us move on to the next story, hoping to fall in love with new characters and settings. Some of us don't accept that the story is over. We start building headcanons or writing fanfiction or joining fandoms. And yet some of us feverishly scribble long video essay scripts at 3 a.m. in the morning. Which is to say, I felt a twang of narrative grief myself after finishing Clair Obscur Expedition 33 recently. And it made me think a lot about the nature of discomfort, grief, and growth. Because not every story that enraptures us comes from media. As the game quietly hints at, the most dangerous stories, the most enchanting stories, are the ones that we tell ourselves. What happens then when we begin to prefer those stories to reality? What happens when we turn towards the safety of what is familiar, even if that familiarity is but a lie we convince ourselves of at the expense of our personal development? Well, sometimes we get lost in the paint. And Clair Obscur is a story about what happens when we do. If, by the way, all this Moon Channel Frenchiness makes you hungry for en croissant, or for that matter, filet mignon, why not consider this video's sponsor, Factor? There's a certain rule that comes with fine cuisine. You can eat well, eat quickly, or eat inexpensively, but you can't pick them all. Or can you? I'd say you can with Factor. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen, chef-crafted, and dietitian-approved meals directly to your door that are ready to eat in just 2 minutes. I work out quite a bit and keep myself fit, so the fact that most of Factor's options deliver 30+ grams of protein per meal is exactly what I look for in my diet. And with my extremely busy lawyer schedule, why, it sure is nice to have such delightful and quality food for a much cheaper price than ordering takeout. Just take a look at this toothsome Athenian-style feta chicken with ratatouille. Moon Channel co-creator Loretta tried this one, and she loved how well the tender and moist chicken paired with the flavorful tomatoes. Can you imagine digging into that after leg day? Doesn't it look magnifique? Try it yourself. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code MOONYFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for 1 year. That's code MOONYFB50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for 1 year. A special thanks, en merci spécial, to Factor for sponsoring this video. In August of 1585, amidst the 80 Years' War between the predominantly Protestant Dutch revolutionaries and their Catholic overlords in Habsburg Spain, the city of Antwerp in what is today Belgium was forced to surrender to Spanish forces. The city had been under siege for just over a year, and famine had taken its toll. Negotiations were held, and it was ultimately decided that Antwerp's Protestant population would have 4 years to settle their affairs before being forcibly removed from the city. Catholics, however, were permitted to remain and in some cases returned from exile. And one of those Catholics who returned, albeit after spending most of his life a Reformed Protestant Calvinist, was a Flemish lawyer by the name of Jan Rubens. Rubens and his family traced their lineage in Antwerp all the way back to 1350, and despite the chaos of war, Antwerp was home. But it had been quite some time since Jan Rubens had departed from Antwerp. The war is called the 80 Years' War for good reason. In the time that had passed, while seeking refuge abroad in the Holy Roman Empire, Rubens had sired 2 sons, the elder of which was Philip Rubens and the younger of which was Peter Paul Rubens. Now, as a man of high standing, Jan made certain that his children received a scholarly education, and Peter Paul in particular would pursue his passion in the arts, leveraging his family's name to get access to study under many of Antwerp's leading painters of the time, who themselves, being largely Catholic now, had traveled to Rome to study the works of leading Italian artists of the period such as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. As Peter Paul refined his craft, he too made the trip to Italy, stopping first in Venice where he became particularly inspired by the paintings of Titian. In Rome, the young Rubens was also ensorcelled by the naturalistic works of Caravaggio, so much so that he made his own copy of the Entombment of Christ. And from these inspirations, Rubens developed a style of painting that, like Michelangelo, like Titian, like Caravaggio, represented life not in its most accurate measure, but in a dramatized way, one that is more real, in a sense, than nature itself. And Rubens would create his supernatural works through the powerful and maybe even exaggerated use of color, and specifically, of shading. Peter Paul Rubens, as you probably don't need me to tell you, is arguably the most highly regarded and influential of the Flemish Baroque painters. But what is often less discussed when Rubens comes up is Rubens' influence on the foundational aesthetic philosophy of 17th century art. In 1671, for example, a massive argument emerged in the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris about whether drawing or color was more important in painting. On the one side, you had the Poissonists, who were named after the painter Nicolas Poisson, and the Poissonists believed that the most important element of a painting was drawing, which is to say, capturing the accurate form of objects. To the Poissonists, color was a purely decorative addition to form, and the lines used to depict form were the fundamental and essential skill of painting. In other words, the design mattered more than the feeling, the reason and logic more than the affect and vibe. On the other side, though, were the Rubenists, named after Rubens, who believed that color, not drawing, not lines, were superior, as color was truer to nature. It is the purpose of painting, the Rubenists say, to go beyond the hard lines of classical art and to deceive the eye by creating a super-real portrayal of the natural. This was a pretty controversial take at the time, believe it or not. There was a prevailing notion amongst artists that painting, as a liberal art, could only be understood and pursued by the learned mind. Drawing was associated with education, art theory, and intellectual pursuit. Color, on the other hand, was associated with raw senses and immediacy. The fear was that a movement towards color over drawing would appeal directly to emotion, thus bypassing reason. In other words, the fight was between the technical artists, those who drew, and the figurative artists, those who colored, or, dare I say, the writers and the painters. You may recognize all of this as something of a precursor to the classics versus modern art debate that persists to this very day. Some things never change. And yet, though the underlying argument may feel both familiar and a little pedantic, there was a lot of critical thinking and progress that emerged from it. In particular, the field of aesthetic theory was greatly advanced, and of the works that emerged from this spat, there is no work as influential, arguably, as Roger Depille's Dialogue sur les coloris, Dialogue on Colors. Depille was an influential painter, engraver, and art critic in his own right, but he was not a member of the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. He was an outsider, and thus did not align with the teachings of the Academy, which at the time were Poissoniste. Fun fact, Depille's final published work before his passing was quite literally a tier list of the 56 major painters with whose work he had acquainted himself with during his travels, of which he considered Rubens to have the best skills of composition. But I digress. Depille's work, Dialogue on Colors, made a very compelling case for the authority of color over form, so much so that it tipped the scales of the argument, changing the course of art in France forever. Of particular impact was a term that Depille introduced into the French lexicon borrowed from Italian that had emerged in Italy during the Renaissance. In the native Italian, chiaro scuro, which Depille translated into French as Clair Obscur, clear on one side, obscured on the other, which when put together represents an aesthetic principle in which meaning emerges through the purposeful contrast of light and dark as opposed to uniform illumination. This borrowed Italian term, though, would take on a life of its own in France. In Italy, chiaroscuro remained a technical term. It was the thing you do to make your paintings look more realistic and natural. But in France, the Royal Academy took the concept and ran with it. French artists began to move away from uniform illumination en masse. For you see, uniform illumination flattens an image, but selective illumination creates hierarchy. By controlling where color is and isn't, where action happens and where it does not, your attention is drawn to different parts of the canvas in order of importance. And when you can create natural hierarchy in a painting, when the painting itself can draw your gaze where it wants, its emotion and power becomes understandable even for those who are untrained in drawing. The power of art becomes accessible to the masses, which in France becomes pretty revolutionary. And in the midst of this, Clair Obscur seems to represent the idea that meaning does not emerge from seeing everything equally clearly, but from seeing some things in relation to what remains in shadow. Too much light flattens, too much darkness obscures entirely. The interplay of light and dark, of clarity and obscurity, creates nuance and meaning. Neither dominates the other, and it is this nuance which ultimately best reflects reality, not merely in how we perceive reality, but in how we understand reality. Clair Obscur has its roots in French aesthetic theory in the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, but it did not remain confined to that medium. Early cinema, constrained as it was by black and white film stock, was forced to rely on the contrast of light and shadow to produce form. But in France, where Clair Obscur had already long been embraced as a means of producing meaning rather than mere realism, where color had prevailed over drawing, the use of light and dark contrast had also already been baked into art, and thus it is no surprise that the French proved to be pioneers in early black and white filmmaking. Consider, for example, the Lumiere brothers, whom I've discussed twice before on the channel and who are credited with organizing the first public film screenings back in 1895. The Lumieres also pioneered an early color photography process known as the autochrome, which was one of the foremost color photography processes used until the popularization of subtractive color film in the 30s. It is perhaps not a fun wink and a nod that our starting town in Expedition 33 is named Lumiere, a name which translates very simply to light. And starting from the very beginning of the game, we are confronted with the core conundrum surrounding the artistic philosophy of Clair Obscur, treading where the French Academy once did. Our cozy starting town of Lumiere is beautiful, it's comforting, it's cozy, it's familiar, it is drawing. In the beginning of the game, we see this comfort all over. We experience the warmth of Gustave's relationship with Maëlle and with Sophie. We see Lune playing her guitar in the bustling markets and the fireworks. And we get our first glimpse, too, of the underlying conflict of the game. All of Lumiere's comforts are temporary. They're an illusion. It is but a facade that obscures a terrible suffering. Every year, the big glowing number in the distance ticks down, and those who reach the age marked by the number disappear. They gommage. But what is most striking is not so much the gommage itself, but what follows. Life in Lumiere continues. The process is absorbed into the rhythm of the town, acknowledged but rarely allowed to disrupt what remains. The familiar persists, even as its edges quietly erode. The town grinds slowly to a terrible fate, an extinction which everybody knows is coming, but whom most have resigned to simply accept. It's from this uncomfortable comfort, from this normalized malaise, that an alternative is presented in the form of the expeditions. Instead of waiting for the gommage and attempting to live in relative comfort, one can join the expeditions into the unknown continent, where the glowing number lies in order to hopefully solve the gommage and save the future of Lumiere. And yet expedition after expedition has left and the gommage remains. From the perspective of Lumiere, from the illusion and clarity of comfort, nothing has changed. It is easy enough then for the Lumiere remnants to conclude that it is better to indulge in the uncomfortable comfort than it is to plunge into the unknown. To leave Lumiere is quite literally a step away from light, away from clarity and into obscurity. Each expedition carries with it both the hope of change and the inevitability of loss, as no expedition returns and no word reaches Lumiere, even as progress on the continent is made. But progress is made, even if it isn't obvious. The game frames this progress as a necessity. If one wagers on certain comfort in the path of impending demise, the outcome must be death. But a wager on the uncertain, even if the possibility of success is only slight, is still an opportunity for life. Waiting in uncomfortable comfort, though numbing, is self-destructive. You lose bits and pieces of yourself until someday there is nothing left of you at all. Now, before the Gommage, before the expeditions, before even Lumiere as we know it, there was a boy and his creation. The world in which the game takes place, the painting, was created by Verso, the middle child of the Descendre family, and he filled it with the figures of his imagination, the early drafts of which still exist in the world itself. This original Verso, the creator, perishes in a fire while rescuing his sister Alicia, but a bit of his soul remains in the world that he made, fueling it in a sense and keeping it alive. Unable to cope with the grief of losing her son, Aline, Verso's mother, takes to the canvas he painted and dwells in the past. She recreates her family in an idealized painted form, and as she lingers in the world of the painting, as she escapes her grief, she also begins to wither in the real world. To Aline, the canvas becomes her comfort. Within it, she needn't confront her loss. She needn't experience the sorrow or anger or frustration. The writers who caused the fire needn't be confronted or thought about. The struggles of her surviving children disappear. Verso can still be spoken to and cared for. Within the painting, the family is still whole, and the sting of grief can be deferred. But Aline's escapism, in turn, prompts her husband, Verso's father, Renoir, to enter the canvas world. And he enters not to preserve, but to erase, where Aline seeks to console her grief through the preservation of the comfortable, even if it requires suspension of disbelief, even if it is uncanny and unreal. Renoir's solution to grief is ultimately not much better. There's a lot of punditry about how Renoir was right all along, but all of that misses something quite critical. Renoir wishes to resolve his grief, and more critically, the grief of others through erasure. Erasure on the surface seems healthier. Renoir seeks closure, he seeks finality. You close the book, you move on. But grief doesn't work like that either. Grief is not a problem with a clean solution. Accepting of one's grief is living with absence, allowing memories to remain. As we will see, there is a way to capture light and dark here. Renoir is avoiding discomfort in his own way. The unsettling nature of the conflict, then, is that ultimately neither Aline nor Renoir are truly embracing grief, or are approaching change in a healthy manner. Aline refuses discomfort. She refuses to inhabit a world where her son is absent. She preserves light, warmth, and familiarity, but in so doing, she flattens the image of her life, erasing the shadow entirely. She replaces nuance with the illusion of comfort instead of processing the darkness such that life has true meaning. Renoir, meanwhile, refuses attachment. He attempts to cut away the canvas altogether, attempts to excise the sorrow of his grief by amputation. He wishes to rush past his grief and attempts to impose his reality on others in the process. He cannot tolerate that others wish to process grief because it forces him to process it too. Lumiere and the expeditions, Aline and Renoir, Clair and Obscur, light and shadow, are not enemies, they coexist. To remove shadow is to flatten the image, to remove light is to obscure it. In the balance, there is nuance and meaningfulness. In the conflict, there's fracture. Aline chooses an unbroken light, a preservation without pain, and Renoir chooses an unrelenting shadow, a pain without refuge. Clair, then, represents a synthesis of both Aline and Renoir's negative coping mechanisms. Clair also does not allow herself time to grieve. She tries to outmaneuver it instead. She tries to engineer her way through it. Like her mother, Clair displaces her grief and reassembles it into a narrative that makes sense. She consolidates her feelings into the war against the writers. Like her father, Clair also seeks control. She restructures the painting without consideration for the artwork it was, in hopes of pushing the entire family forward into the war she deems to be more important than grief. As such, although Clair is the only member of the Descendre family who never truly retreats into the world of the painting, she is ultimately just as consumed by it. But what about Alicia? The child Verso died to save, the one burned in the fire. Unlike the rest of her family, Alicia doesn't encounter the canvas exclusively as a symbol of loss. Instead, she's reborn into the painting as Maëlle and lives inside the world that her family fights over. Alicia develops new attachments, a new family, and she loves the people of Lumiere not as elements of Verso's creation, but as companions in their own right. By the time the truth of the canvas is revealed, Alicia has already lived the full spectrum of feeling inside of it, including hope, despair, and grief. Alicia has already experienced loss in the form of losing Gustav, and she has already learned how to move forward as Mael. But Alicia inherits the fracture. She inherits the toxic processing of grief that runs throughout her family. Aline tries to preserve the past, Renoir tries to destroy the past, and Clair tries to control the past. Alicia, though, lives in the past. As such, even though she learns the fundamental lessons of the expeditions, even though she experiences grief, even though she knows that when one falls, we continue, when Alicia remembers who she ultimately is, she reaches not towards the unknown future, but towards that preserved past. Left to her own devices, Alicia chooses to remain within the painting. She chooses comfort. She chooses to preserve Verso's world, and in so doing, to keep the wound open, never confronting her grief. The world she shaped continues, intact and untouched by the demands of reality. Painted Verso remains present and the pain of loss is deferred. The story doesn't end. It remains unchanged, but Alicia remains unchanged with it. And we are left with a deeply uncanny happiness as a result. A facade of stability and control that betrays an addiction to the comfortable, and the inevitable loss that must eventually be faced. Alicia believes that she has assumed control over her situation, but it is a comfort sustained only through fantasy, a facsimile of reality that cannot be allowed to change. The warmth, the smiles, the relationships are make-believe. And thus, in the endings, it is not Alicia who ultimately embraces the full weight of grief. It is, instead, Verso. The painted Verso, Aline's reflection of the boy who created the canvas, is the one who insists that the painting must end. He chooses the difficult truth that Alicia cannot, that grief must be lived with, not escaped from, that the sometimes numbly comfortable past cannot be preserved without imprisoning the living inside it. That memory must remain, but the world must still be allowed to change. This is fundamentally different from Renoir's Erasure, by the way. Renoir imposes closure. He treats grief as something to eliminate, as a problem to solve. But painted Verso has lived in the canvas, completely experienced it, maybe even has romantic attachments to Lune or Ciel, and yet still lets the world end. To Renoir, the past must end so that we can move on. But for Verso, it is we who must move on, and thus the past must end. Do you see the distinction there? Healthy grief requires embracing discomfort without retreating into illusion or into a forced closure. We move on from the past first before closing the book on it. If we close the book on it first and then move on after, we risk never fully processing it. The preserved image of the past cannot be lived inside forever. It must remain what it is, a memory, while life continues beyond it. The preserved image of the past must fade, not for the sake of those who came before, but for those who come after. For a long stretch of Clair Obscur, uncertainty is all that we are given. We move forward without clear explanations. We fight without knowing who our enemy truly is. And though we are surrounded by beauty, brutality follows not far behind. Through the devastation and loss, we are made to wonder sometimes if the comfort of Lumiere might have been preferable to the suffering and exposure of the expedition. It's in the midst of this unpredictability, well before understanding has been achieved, that we meet the cheerful and bubbly Esquier. Esquier doesn't promise us safety or resolve for us any great mysteries of the world. He doesn't explain the fracture or the paintress or the gommage. He instead does something simpler and arguably rarer in the world of Clair Obscur. He makes us feel warm. Esquier mourns when we mourn and celebrates when we celebrate. He carries us forward without asking where the journey will end. He seems to understand the world more deeply than most of its inhabitants, and yet he shows no desire to master it, reshape it, or escape from it. In Western culture, and Western philosophy even, we are often taught to divide the world cleanly in two. But you will recall the tradition from which the game takes its name, Clair Obscur, is not about division as much as it is about tension. Meaning emerges from contrast. This idea is nothing new. Consider the yin-yang, an old Taoist symbol, which represents the idea that all light has its darkness, all darkness has its light, and that life is about the harmony, the balance of light and dark, of clair and obscur, of Wheee, and dare I say, of Whooo. You may recognize these peculiar sounds as Esquier's way of expressing positive and negative feelings, joy and sorrow, or excitement and disappointment as the case may be. But take note though of how Esquier frames the Wheee and the Whooo. The Wheee does not cancel the Whooo, and the Whooo does not extinguish the Wheee. Joy does not invalidate grief, and grief does not invalidate joy. They exist together, oscillating back and forth, creating harmony. Esquier remains at peace with himself and the world around him. Despite his childlike nature, Esquier is the most emotionally mature character in the game. He knows that the world is fragile. He knows that it's just a painting. He knows that the end of his existence is possible. He knows that the verso he travels with is not the original verso, and that one day even this reflection may disappear. The painting is all he knows, and yet he accepts its impermanence without bitterness and without denial. That acceptance is the very thing that the Descendre family struggles to achieve. Aline tries to preserve the painting, Renoir tries to destroy it, Clair tries to reshape it, Alicia tries to rebuild it, but Esquier simply inhabits it in the present, fully and without illusion, knowing that it will not last. And isn't that kind of what life is? Our time in this painting that we call life must also someday come to an end. Is it not better than to live, not buried in an illusion of comfort, of perfect but numbing clarity, but in the present, with the fullest spectrum of experience, even if living means exposure, or loss, or confusion, or discomfort? Esquier teaches us that discomfort does not negate joy or wonder, and neither does joy invalidate our pain. It is the interplay between Wheee and Whooo, between light and dark, between clair and obscur that creates meaning. You can accept the painting for what it is, not be lost in it, and still live meaningfully into the future. A meaningful life is, as Esquier might say, something of a wee-woo, wee-woo situation. One of my favorite paintings of all time is Mark Rothko's number 16 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in beautiful New York City. I make a pilgrimage to see it from time to time, and without fail, every time I stand there, transfixed by the painting, I hear someone remark that they just don't get it. Oh, it's just boxes, or oh, I could draw that myself. It doesn't frustrate me to hear those things anymore, but it does make me pensive, because these people can see the drawing, but they cannot see the color. They can see the light and the dark, but not the meaning that emerges in the space between them. Meaning that comes not intrinsically from the painting, but from one's own contemplation projected onto it. The painting is an imperfect mirror for the soul, and perhaps that's what good stories are meant to be as well. We can complete every side quest, beat the impossible boss rush tower, and see every ending and still miss what a story was asking of us. Some stories don't reveal their meaning through victory or completion, but through reflection, through the willingness to sit with what they leave behind. Clair Obscur is not a story about choosing light over darkness or darkness over light. It's a story about living in both, about living not in the past, but with the past, and about the understanding that through the discomfort, through the suffering, through the hardship, that the future comes, and tomorrow still arrives. We can allow ourselves to be railroaded into futures that promise comfort only because they mask the reality that we are unhappy, or unsatisfied, or even miserable. Or we can embrace the gut-wrenching discomfort of letting illusions fall away and step ourselves back out into the real world. A world that is not flat and uniformly lit, but one whose meaning emerges through its Clair Obscur. I've been your host, Mooney. I hope you enjoyed this short rambly video made of more raw emotion perhaps than anything else. If you are interested, Larita and I are working on an extended director's cut of this video that goes much deeper into Alicia, available exclusively on Patreon. A special thanks to our sponsor Factor, to our beloved patrons without whom none of this would be possible, and of course, to viewers like you. Thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel.